Welcome, Alexandra. It's absolutely a delight to have you on the podcast. Obviously, we know each other and in our academic lives, so I'm really delighted that you can join us today, Craig and I, for MQ's Open Mind podcast. And we're really keen to discuss really loneliness. Because loneliness, when I started out as an academic, that wasn't really a topic or focus in terms of research or even on policy. But that's been a big change. And that's something we're hoping to get into maybe with some discussions with you. But maybe first, it's always good to get some sense of who you are. So could you, I know you're a psychiatrist, but can you tell us a bit about your journey into psychiatry and really what your interest in? I know you have an interest in suicide, but it's broader than that. It's also in loneliness and other aspects. So maybe can you start at the beginning, please, Alexandra?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I think, the social determinants of health have always been of interest to me. So going through my medical training, I did have a suspicion that I would be interested in psychiatry, but you obviously only know that when you actually have your psychiatry placements. And I really, really enjoyed them. So at the first opportunity, really decided to do a training in psychiatry. And after I'd got all of my exams out of the way, this opportunity came up to pursue an academic career. So I came to UCL, where I was taught by some great psychiatric epidemiologists, and immediately I wanted to focus on suicide. And I started off by looking at the impact of the suicide of someone close to you on your own mental health. And obviously part of that is that, the extreme feelings of loneliness that you can feel after a sudden bereavement by any cause. So that's how I came to be interested in suicide, and then further on down the line to be interested in loneliness, because obviously that is a risk factor, as your own team have demonstrated in a really great systematic review, is a risk factor for suicide and for suicide attempt.
Yeah. And so then I was saying it's really interesting, the balance, if you're a clinical academic as you are, that balance between that clinical work and how that informs with your ongoing research. So is that synergy evident in the work that you've been doing or have done?
It really is, actually. And because the way my job plan works, like many clinical academics, it's 50-50. So I spend part of my time in a veteran service. It's a veteran mental health service for the whole of London. And as is always the case when you start to do some research in your clinical work, you will bring hypotheses from your clinical work and you'll test them in your research work. And then you'll bring your findings from your research work and you'll use them in your clinical practice. So when I first started out as a psychiatrist, I would always ask people, is there anyone in your family who's died by suicide? And that's obviously standard practice for any clinician doing a risk assessment. But then when I started to investigate the impact of the suicide of a close contact, I realized that it didn't have to be a relative. It could be a friend, it could be a partner, it could be an ex-partner. So now I always ask about that in my clinical encounters, and I just discover all of these patients who've got these horrendous experiences of knowing people who died by suicide. And if you think about people in mental health services, they often meet other patients in mental health services. They might have relationships with people who've got mental health problems. And that in itself increases their risk that they might experience the suicide of people with severe mental illness. And then thinking about loneliness now, it's only in the last few years that I've been interested in loneliness. And I never used to ask about loneliness before. Mm-hmm. And I suppose partly that's because I just wasn't aware that it was so clinically significant. But maybe I was also drawn in by how stigmatizing that question could be. And I knew that people didn't want to be asked how lonely they are. And so now in my clinical practice, I will listen to a patient's account of their social situation, and I might ask a question which seems quite non-judgmental, like, you're talking about how, for example, since you left the Navy and you've been adjusting to civilian life, you're no longer surrounded by all of your friends and colleagues. Do you sometimes feel a bit lonely? So it kind of gives them permission to say, well, actually, I do feel very lonely. And I'm really struck by the problem of loneliness in the veterans community. And of course, these are people who often come across as very, very socially adept and say, do you think any of your friends realize how lonely you are? They would say, oh, no, I'd never want them to know that. So it really brings home the stigma of loneliness that we definitely pick up when we study it in the research side of my life.
Well, no, that's really set up, I think, the heart of this podcast is really maybe what we mean by loneliness, because I think we all have an intuitive understanding what we mean by loneliness, and there's loneliness and there's social isolation. So maybe could you tell us a bit about how you define in your research or in your clinical work how do you define loneliness, and then how is that different or similar to it being socially isolated?
Well, I'm part of a network of researchers and policymakers and practitioners and people with lived experience of loneliness. And we're part of the Loneliness and Social Isolation and Mental Health Research Network. And so in all the work that we've done, we've tended to conceptualize loneliness probably most simply in terms of the subjective feeling of your social relationships just not being up to scratch, not being what you would desire. And that is in contrast to the objective number of social contacts you have, which better describes the concept of social isolation. And I think that people who tend to be very socially unisolated, so they've got lots of friends and family, find it really difficult to name their loneliness because they can't conceive that it's possible that you could have all these friends and family and yet feel so lonely. And actually, that's probably even more stigmatizing for them because they think, nobody's going to take this seriously. They'll point out how many friends I've got, whether in my day-to-day, face-to-face encounters or my friends on social media. How can they possibly understand how I feel? And yet it's quite possible to feel really lonely when you're surrounded by people. And in fact, in the qualitative data that we've analysed in our group, we've often observed that it's when people have loads and loads of people around them. They might be at a party or in a pub or in their hall of residence, surrounded by people. And yet their loneliness is really compounded by this awareness of all these people around them who could theoretically assuage their feelings of loneliness, but somehow it just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
With the rise of like social media, where people feel more connected with one another, do you feel that it's about loneliness? It's getting worse?
Well, I think everybody thinks it's getting worse. And we hear people talk about the epidemic of loneliness. And I do really struggle with that concept. And I don't use that term because I think whilst we all think it's getting worse, we really do have to attend to what rigorous research studies tell us. And so whilst there are studies which have tracked, particularly during COVID, levels of loneliness, there are some very different findings. So recently, a study that your group did, Rory, showed that in a very mixed, in a sample of very mixed age groups, overall levels of loneliness didn't change over the COVID pandemic period. But if you looked at specific age groups, you could see there were very different patterns by age group and by time. And then there are other studies which perhaps looked at specific age groups. There's one study I've read recently, for example, and that showed that loneliness in older adults had increased over the COVID pandemic. And that was particularly the case for people living alone, and that makes sense, and for women. But, there's been some particularly interesting findings in young people. And we know from a recent systematic review, actually, which looked at estimates of the prevalence of loneliness in young people across countries across the world over a long period of time, well predating the pandemic. And this shows that loneliness is increasing in young people in countries across the world. So this is something which is happening in that age group. But when you look at the COVID period specifically, there is a sense from the data that actually kids who were old enough to have their own devices, to be socially connected in an online world, were better off than younger kids who didn't have that agency in terms of connecting with their friends. So they were really quite isolated, whereas their older siblings actually did quite well because they had that outlet beyond the family home where really things were very, very limited. So I think there are very, very different patterns in different age groups. I think, Rory, your study showed that there were no differences by ethnicity. You had some interesting patterns in your study, and definitely people with mental health problems had far higher prevalence of loneliness. And we specifically focused on this group, our loneliness network, during the pandemic, because we did some interviews specifically with people with pre-existing mental health problems, and we asked them about their experience of loneliness. And it was really, really striking findings, because these were people who, they weren't so adept at adjusting to the new online world. They really, really struggled with that. Their anxieties around health were, really, really augmented by the sort of general, panic about the infectious agents they might encounter when they're out in public. They really, really felt forgotten by the policy community. It seemed to be all about, kind of public outrage over the new onset of mental health problems in previously healthy people, whereas they were thinking, hang on, we've had mental health problems for years and no one really seems to care about us. And they had, they were cut off from their friends, they were cut off from mental health services, which they perceived to be woefully inadequate. And the online services that were put in their place were really not good enough to meet their needs, as well as a complete shutdown of a lot of services they'd relied on in the voluntary sector community. So it really, really was a rough ride for that group of people. And I think we've tried to really prioritise that group in our research, because they are tending to be forgotten in other pieces of research, which tend to focus on new onset anxiety and depression.
No, I think you're. I think you made such an important point about. Well, the broader point is we're not all in this pandemic together. We never have been, and there's lots of communities and individuals who've been left behind. And I think the people with pre-existing mental health problems, and all the data we've got, and seeing other countries across, not just in the UK, across the world. I mean the huge impact on people's mental health. Doesn't matter which indicator. If you have pre-existing mental health problems, much more lonely, much more likely to have depressive symptoms, much more likely to be suicidal, and so on. But the thing that struck us when we were looking at our more recent data, so we've been tracking, Craig, for your benefit, we've been tracking the mental health and well-being of a sample of the UK since COVID began. And absolutely, Alexandra, as you say, that the older adults, we didn't see the initial phases of the pandemic, we actually relatively stable were the levels of loneliness. Now, young people were reporting high levels of loneliness, people with pre-existing mental health problems, women, people from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds, all the stuff we would have predicted because of obviously pre-existing inequalities just being exacerbated. But there is certainly some signals as the pandemic has gone along, older adults are starting to report, it's still much lower than younger people, starting to report higher levels of loneliness. So I think it highlights that group again, another group who've been overlooked. So I think it's so important, this work, and it's great to see that you're trying to not just do the quantitative survey-based work, but really trying to get to the nuts and bolts and how these people are experiencing loneliness. But the number of times I've heard that line you said about, people with pre-existing mental health problems going, what? Oh, hold on, hello, we've been here for a long, long time experiencing these difficulties, and it's only now there's this light shone on it because of this outrage, as you say, of the pandemic. So I think that really it reminds us of that we have a long way to go in terms of achieving anything to do with parity of esteem or the like. But can I just bring you back, Alexandra, just to that? So we've made the distinction between obviously loneliness and sort of social isolation or being surrounded by people it doesn't protect. I wonder then, so if somebody was to say to you, and this is a wee bit unfair, I think, but if somebody was to say to you, right, Alexandra Pitman, how do we solve loneliness, right? And I know it'd be tailored. I know it's a very naive question, but actually it's a question psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals are asked all the time. So how would you go about solving this problem of loneliness? Because I agree, it's not an epidemic. I don't think that's helpful.
I mean, there's so many ways at coming at this. And I think that, first of all, you have to think about the approach you take. Are you taking a psychological approach and trying to address cognitions, or are you taking a social approach and thinking about the opportunities available to one? Or are you thinking of a combination of the two? And given that we don't really know whether either or work particularly well, we don't really know if they work in combination. So we're really in the very early stages of understanding what works. And there's some really good systematic reviews coming out at the moment that start to give us a sense that it's probably quite helpful to target cognitions. And actually, you could argue that you need to do that in order to make meaningful changes to their, social networks. But the other key question is, you may come up with this wonderful intervention with really fabulous, trial evidence to support its effectiveness. But if nobody wants it, that was all a complete waste of money. And this comes back to the stigma of loneliness, because if I'm trying to entice you into my kind of anti-loneliness intervention, there's a lot of stuff on the tin that's really kind of not very attractive here. And this is really the case for young people and for whom loneliness is probably most stigmatizing. And so that's why we've been trying to do studies with young people to ask them, what would you actually want? And we're actually recruiting for a study at the moment, and that is involving a researcher interviewing young people And initially, interestingly, we were planning to do it as focus groups, and it was really difficult to recruit to that. And I think that says a lot about how uncomfortable people feel about discussing these things in a group. So now we're doing it as face-to-face interviews to find out what people would actually like. And we're getting the sense that badging things as an anti-loneliness intervention is really not going to bring people in. And offering things as a universal intervention, so for all young people in a class, to help them, reframe the way they think about their own loneliness or other people who are socially isolated or who appear lonely. That's probably a better approach than trying to target the people who feel lonely. Now, there is one benefit, I would say, of the period we've just been through during COVID, is that it has possibly destigmatized loneliness, because so many people have really felt lonely and bereft of certain social connections. So I think that has tended to destigmatize being able to describe or be aware of one's own loneliness, and also identify someone who might be in need of interventions. But I do think we need to continue to understand what will work for specific ethnic minority groups, for specific age groups, for specific genders, because otherwise we're at the risk of producing or investing in interventions designed for everybody that aren't really going to help people that much.
I was more of a question of, how can somebody identify if they're feeling lonely?
Because there's probably quite a lot of denial involved because of the stigma. I think it's sometimes helpful to read the accounts of people that you might identify with and see if there's anything in there that you recognize. So at the moment, we're doing a couple of studies, which I think have given me some really interesting insights. So on the one hand, we've done a study where we were particularly interested in international students and their experience of loneliness, because they're a group that, Rory, you and I know that universities are very concerned about, because they're a substantial proportion of the students that we teach in the universities, and we are aware that they can feel very, very disconnected. And a lot of them were being taught online during the pandemic, which made things very difficult for them. So what we're doing at the moment is we're analysing data from the BBC loneliness experiment. And this was where, thousands and thousands of people were asked questions like, what does loneliness mean to you? And what we've done for this particular study is we picked out the responses from people who are international students up to the age of 40. And we are doing a thematic analysis of what loneliness means to them. And there are these really heartrending accounts of people who say, I literally have nobody to confide in, nobody to go and have a meal with, nobody to share my joys with, nobody to share my difficulties with. And all of us can identify with moments where we felt like that. But this is a consistent experience for these students throughout their whole time at university. And even though they have social connections back at home, they are just online or down the telephone, and they are inadequate for what they actually need in their new host country. The other study that we're doing, which again analyses data from the BBC loneliness experiment, is a study which looks at the responses to the question about what do you do to address loneliness. And for this study, we just focused on young people. So we looked at people aged 16 to 18, and we analysed those data, again, using the approach of thematic analysis. And this, again, was fascinating, because we found a lot of the things that you might expect to see, which I've already mentioned. When I'm lonely, I connect with my friends, I try and meet new people, I try and change the way I think about my loneliness, and I try and go out and put on a brave face. But there was this subgroup of people who were extraordinary, because they described that they tried to change the way they felt about solitude. So they tried to enjoy their solitude as an adaptation to feeling lonely. And we were really struck by this, because it just seemed, that these 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds, they were ahead of the game, and they knew that this was a really important life skill that they needed to do, they needed to acquire in order to cope with life over the life course, because we will all have moments where our social circles shrink, we move jobs, relationships break down, people die, people just don't really meet our expectations sometimes, and they're not there when we need them. So we will all feel an inadequacy in our social relationships. We will feel in solitude at times. And while solitude is often a really important state of being, it's a time to kind of recharge and just have space to think for ourselves. And I think that's a component of good mental health. It can be quite painful when it persists for a long period of time, but having the skills to really enjoy that solitude was seen by these young people as really important, and they found it very helpful. So it's studies like that, which I think are really important to complement the trial evidence, because we know that if we try and deliver interventions that are described by young people as helpful, then there will at least be reasonable uptake of those interventions.
It really highlights, obviously, the importance of this co-production approach and co-produced research. But then the challenge is, how do we translate that knowledge then into getting it into the trials? I think that's, and I think we still struggle with that. I mean, as a field more broadly in mental health. But in terms of the payback, never mind improving the well-being of everybody. I mean, the data on loneliness as a predictor of mortality, not just from suicide, but from physical health problems, I mean, or suicidal behavior, but I mean, it's really stark as well. Is there some statistic, I might have got this wrong, that I can't remember whatever level of loneliness, but there's some of the sort of classic work from the United States showing that it's equivalent of smoking, is it 20 cigarettes a day or something like that? It's something, I mean, really stark.
I don't know how they've kind of equivalized the cigarette, but it's the sort of thing that gets policymakers thinking, okay, I'm going to take this seriously now. So I think that's been quite helpful for the loneliness research agenda, in people sitting up and taking notice. And now we have a tackling loneliness strategy team, which is a cross-governmental policy team, which is fantastic. And they work really closely with researchers. So they've invited a whole host of researchers across the spectrum of loneliness research to join them in creating an evidence group. So they will ensure that there isn't that disconnect between research and policy. So they will say, please, can you map the evidence and work out where there are gaps? And then they will try and commission research that fills those gaps. So that's been really, really helpful for us to work much more closely with the policymakers. And it's been really rewarding to see how seriously they take this topic as a policy priority, but also how willing they are to work with researchers to try and get our timelines the same, because that's often a problem when researchers are working with policymakers. And
how is that your experience with the policymakers, because they're often on a cycle, an election cycle? So, I mean, I don't know what it's like in England, but I imagine it's the same in the world over, is sometimes the priorities are obviously short-term gains rather than looking at the long-term. So have you had any experience of seeing any of these short-term gains already, or has everything been overtaken by COVID, or have you said, I mean, what has been delivered? Because in Scotland, we also have a loneliness strategy and so on. So I'm just keen to see what has actually happened on the ground.
I think COVID did slow things down, actually. And I think they were very upfront with us about what they wish they'd been able to do and haven't done. And of course, you see a lot of civil servants being redeployed and sent to different departments. And then someone comes in and has to refresh the agenda and see where it's all going. But it is still, quite painstaking to identify those evidence gaps. Yeah. So that is a limiting step, really. And we've only just done that. And we produced the evidence gap report this January. And so now the plan is to try and commission the research to fill the gap. So I guess it always proceeds slower than you imagine. And I'm always feel that, policymakers look at us researchers and our rather long timelines and think, what are they doing? But, we feel that we're working quite hard on it. But, it's just like the grant cycle is interminable, isn't it? So we do tend to work in a sort of stepped approach. So I think, we're meeting again this week to see where we've got to. We're meeting regularly. And, I suppose that sometimes there are periods of time when there isn't a minister for loneliness, because there might be a cabinet reshuffle and there's a bit of a kind of hiatus over, who's been given that portfolio. But, that it hasn't been dropped completely. So it does seem to be a priority. And the fact that this team exists and is a truly cross-governmental team shows that they're appreciating that there are impacts across every single department in the government. It's actually housed within the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport.
Oh, okay.
And I think that that's important, because it shows that there are lots of ways you can package interventions to address loneliness, whether it's through, engagement in sport, in the arts, using social media. And so I think that's been a really valuable experience, actually.
Yeah, and I think what's good is, what it illustrates is loneliness, it really has moved up the list of priorities, and reflected this year, the Mental Health Awareness Week theme is loneliness. So, so I think, again, those things, I'm unaware of there previously been a loneliness theme. So I'm assuming that's the first time, is it?
Yes, it is. But I think there's that, every summer now there's a loneliness week, which is actually in June. So we're going to have 2 weeks of loneliness, research highlighted this year, which is great.
And
so
is your group doing work along or any events for either?
Well, in the first of those weeks, so Mental Health Awareness Week, we're going to be tweeting some research studies throughout the week, and also some videos which are made by an organisation called Bespoke, which I know that you'll be speaking at their conference, and that will be available online for people to watch. So we'll be producing videos that will be produced by Bespoke during that week. I know that Imperial College have a whole week of events, and a colleague who we both work with, Lindsay Dewar, she'll be giving a talk about how to use social media to promote social connectedness and good mental health. So there's lots of events going on. But for us, our big event is actually happening in the second of those weeks, in June, the week in June. And our event on the 15th of June is our final showcase symposium. So our funded period is coming to an end in the next year. So we're basically going to present lots of research that we've funded over the course of that time, and lots of people who will be presenting important research studies that really kind of highlight the important findings that have been produced over that period. So I'm looking forward to that. And again, that's free. Anyone can register online for that.
That's excellent. Lots of exciting things going on. If somebody gave you £10 million, what would you invest it in? And maybe thinking about loneliness, perhaps, given this a podcast about loneliness, is there like some real ideal study you think, if we knew the answer to that question or did that study, that would really help us with the loneliness issues? I think it was really unfair. Sorry, Alex.
No, I think it's a really good question. I'd love to be able to find a way of creating a sort of schedule that wasn't too onerous for each individual, that kind of characterized their past experience of social connections, what makes them feel connected, their own profile of kind of cognitive biases about how they perceive social threat and social interaction, and their own preferences about things they enjoy, things they value, and how much they value time spent alone and how much time they need alone, and also they need to be an enjoyable period of time being alone. And to use that profile as a way to tailor their own kind of anti-loneliness intervention, again, as a kind of life skill or tool, so that if they do go through a bereavement or a job change or any difficult circumstance, they can work out what is the best approach, whether it's psychological or social, to temper that so that their sense of loneliness is reduced, and that will benefit their mental and physical health.
No, absolutely. No, I would give you the money. I would give you the money.
Me too. What would you say it would be in your image, like the future of mental health research?
I really, I'm very interested by suicide research, as Rory knows, and I'm very interested in how somebody can accumulate so many influences over their life course that will contribute to their own sense of suicidality. And that might be a mixture of, the structural things that we know influence suicidal thoughts, like financial problems, relationship breakdown, mental illness, things like that. But we also are influenced by all the people around us, and people we know who die by suicide or attempt suicide or talk about their suicidal thoughts, by people we see depicted in the media, whether they were celebrities or not. And all of that can influence our own thoughts about suicide. And I'm, working at the moment on how people assimilate all that and how that changes their own thoughts about suicide. And it is also connected to the way we relate to people around us, because it relates to the degree to which we feel we belong to other people. Because as Rory's described so well in his own model of suicidal behaviour, when people feel that they have no place in the world and they just don't belong, which is equivalent to that sense of feeling lonely and disconnected, and when they feel that they're a burden on people around them, that's when they feel that they would be better off dead and that society would be better off without them. So, what I really want to understand is how people can really feel so disconnected and of no value to other people that they really feel that suicide is a better option for them. So that's my personal vision of mental health research, but I appreciate it's just one aspect of it.
Yeah. It's your research is quite difficult. I imagine hearing some of these stories. How do you switch off? Like, what do you do to manage your own mental health?
Well, I had a meeting just before this with a student who's reading through some transcripts of some interviews that we did with people bereaved by suicide, and they are really, really harrowing. And I was just reflecting with her that it was really important that we had the space in supervision to talk about how awful these were. Mm-hmm. And because if she'd just been left to her own devices to just sit there and read through these transcripts by herself without that opportunity to process it, that would have just been horrendous for her. So I think it's really important that suicide researchers have a network, which is both formal in sense of supervisory relationships or teams who discuss findings together, but also peers that you can share those experiences with. But it's also essential that we have a life outside of our work, which allows us to completely disconnect from all of that. So, things like in academic life, there's a bombardment of emails. I know that Rory labours under, hundreds of emails and requests. And I think it's really important that we just take a complete break at weekends and have hobbies that mean we totally disconnect from that. My own personal mental health tip is to go to your local Mind charity shop, buy a really complex 1,000-piece jigsaw of a theme that, a view that really pleases your retinue, and then just get stuck into that.
So this is something I've learned about you today. I didn't know about your fascination with jigsaws.
It's more stressful for me.
Yeah, I know, exactly. And are these, but yeah, I mean, in years gone by, I enjoyed a jigsaw, I must say, but having kids, I remember the challenge was then doing jigsaws, and inevitably there'd be pieces missing. And then, because we'd have lost the pieces. And then I used to always find that I struggled with that. Where is the missing pieces of the jigsaw? But obviously that wouldn't have happened to you, Alexandra, clearly.
It's part of the joy, just feeling really kind of wound up about it. But I think this does relate to what we're talking about, because jigsaws are things that you can do in solitude and enjoy your solitude. You can do it with people buzzing around you and talking to you and maybe helping you out a bit, but not for the final piece because you want to do that yourself. So I think it's really hard for people to be told they should be practicing mindfulness all the time, because it seems to be the panacea that everybody suggests for everything, and it's really difficult to achieve a state of mindfulness. And I think that we need to kind of let people off the hook a little bit and let them find their own way to achieve this kind of other world where they're not thinking about other things, because they're thinking, ooh, that shade of blue is very similar to the houses in the top left corner. So, that's what works for me. But I think people need to find the trick that works for them, because it's not necessarily something that involves following the mindfulness handbook.
Mm-hmm. I think we all have our own ways of managing these things, I suppose. But I think one of the things I've really taken away from what you've chatted about earlier was we should be more connected. We should be doing all of these things, or feeling as if we are. And I think there is something about us thinking about what our own needs are. And actually Craig and I have talked about this, about Craig, won't mind me saying, because he shared it himself, is that you like to spend time on your own as well, Craig, and you really value that. And I think that's really important.
And I think that it's a real luxury to spend time by yourself, because if you think there'll be lots of people, and we saw this clinically in the pandemic, because they couldn't find any time to have privacy for their Zoom calls. They have people around them all the time. And actually carving out some time when you really are alone and can use that time to enjoy yourself, rather than catching up with cooking meals or trying to go through your benefits forms or something like that. It's quite a privilege to have solitude sometimes. But then conversely, for other people, they just have too much solitude and a real sense that nobody wants to fill that time with them, and that they would be a burden on others if they said, oh, would you like to join me to do something? And that sense of being so repellent to other people is just so eroding of your self-image, isn't it? And that's what comes up again and again in the qualitative research that we do.
I know it is heartbreaking. It's a number of people in our studies we've spoken to, and it's over the years. And as you described, really heartbreakingly, Alexandra, is that sense of I'm not worthy or worth somebody spending time with me, or just even connecting with me or sharing a word. And I suppose in that context, then, have we got a tip just for anybody out there? What can we do, any one of us, to help somebody else feel less lonely?
I suspect from reading these accounts in the qualitative data we've analysed is that there's some groundwork to do first with regard to enjoying solitude and being comfortable in oneself. And what you're describing, Craig, is somebody who feels really comfortable being by themselves and telling other people, this is something I enjoy. And once you feel comfortable in that state, I think you're better prepared to make overtures to other people and say, shall we do this? Because I think that there are all these social rules to navigate about not looking too desperate, not appearing needy. And these are really complex communications. And I talked earlier about international students. They're trying to navigate this in a completely different culture. I think that trying to examine the way you feel about your own loneliness and the way you feel about other people can be quite instructive, because if you have these absolute views, nobody's going to want to hang out with me, everybody's staring at me because I'm standing by myself, these are really going to, cut out all, attempts at making overtures to other people. So I think being aware of the way one might have quite unhelpful thoughts about how other people might react to one, and perhaps challenging those thoughts, can help when you do make the effort to sign up for a course, change jobs, do something different. And, the more time that you spend enjoying your solitude out in public, so sitting in a cafe with your book, whatever, the more that you create opportunities to interact with other people. But again, it sounds lame, but it's important to say it's just so different for everybody. So I've said before that, the state of research into what works to address loneliness is really in its infancy. And I think the more that we investigate this as a team of researchers and practitioners and people with lived experience, the more we can provide kind of tips for people that are helpful. And I guess I should really promote something that we produced recently, which was a loneliness resource for people who feel lonely, by people who've experienced loneliness and mental health problems. And it was a co-produced guide on what to do if you feel lonely. And we've included this as a resource on our loneliness and social isolation and mental health website. So I think that kind of thing where it's tailored to a specific group can be really helpful, because if you identify with the people who wrote the guide, it's more likely to be helpful to you.
Yeah, I think it's great. And if it's okay, then we'll in the show notes, we can add links to those resources. That'd be fantastic. Alexandra, we're sort of coming towards the end, and I have a couple of quick fire questions, which I haven't told you about. I forgot to. So,
these are the most important questions as well.
But just given we've been touching on such heavy material, it's nice to end a bit more in the light, a little more lighter note. But Alexandra, first, anything you're thinking we should be saying?
I think one thing that's important to say is that there are quite limited validated measures for capturing loneliness. And we tend to see the UCLA loneliness scale that's used in a lot of studies, the de Jong-Geerveld loneliness measure that's used in a lot of studies. But there are concerns that perhaps they might not be capturing the full range of experiences of loneliness. And they might be probably very culturally narrow. So I think we do need a lot more work to understand and capture the experience of loneliness in specific groups and develop measures that would perhaps be more suitable for them.
So, Alexandra, the last two quick fire questions. So, and apologies for not giving you advance warning of these, but let's see how we go. So if you're thinking about somebody living or dead, it doesn't matter who they are, it doesn't have to link to loneliness, but who you could have dinner with, who do you think, who would it be? Who would top of your list?
I think this reflects my own specific interest in suicide research. So I'd be very interested to meet somebody who was a researcher who was very influential in the 1970s called Edwin Schneiderman. Mm-hmm. And he was the first person really to draw attention to the impact of suicide loss. And he came up with the first estimate of how many people were greatly affected by suicide loss, which actually is a significant underestimate when we think about what we currently think about the great number of people affected. But what's so important was that he was the first person to draw attention to this and to think about, all of the manifestations of grief after suicide loss, including loneliness.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Ed, because I never met him, but I wrote to him. And so I wrote a book in the year 2000 and on suicide, and I covered a lot of his work, and I sent him a copy, and so he replied, and I've got the reply.
Have you?
But I was so delighted and honored. For those who are listening, this person, Ed Schneiderman, is like the founding person in sort of the modern suicide research, and he founded the first suicide prevention centers in Los Angeles, I think it was, and he spent from the 1950s for about 50 years in almost. I think he died not that long ago. A really tiring force and really incredible in terms of bringing, I always think he brought the humanity into suicide prevention research. So that's a great suggestion. So that's that's interesting. Okay, and the last one then, Alexandra, is thinking back to we're all a bit older now, and you're thinking back to your younger self. What advice would you give your 16-year-old or 18-year-old Alexandra about what you've learned since?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think that social relationships are so important to our everyday quality of life and the way we approach our careers and our personal relationships. And I think it goes back to what they said about enjoying solitude and learning, like Craig, to realize actually it's a really enjoyable state of being, and to never feel over that period embarrassed about standing alone at a party or sitting alone in a cafe, to model, enjoying that time alone. Because I think we can sometimes crowd out our ability to just have that white noise by our seeking out of social connections, and some of them maybe aren't of particularly great quality. And actually, if we preserve that white noise, and this is a term that I learned in a kind of leadership course actually at UCL. They talked about the importance of having time, whether you're making a cup of tea, to just be in the moment. And I suppose they're really talking about mindfulness. But you can crowd that out with, tweeting somebody or making a phone call. And actually, I think I wish that 16-year-old self had embraced solitude as a really important part of their life, to really enjoy that white noise.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. Just taking time, the quiet times are really, really important, aren't they? Craig, any final thoughts from you?
No, just to go on like what you just said, Alexandra, it's true. Because when I was like 16, 18, I felt really uncomfortable, and the fact that like, why can't I join in with the group? There's something wrong with me. Whereas over time, I feel more comfortable in it, and it's not an issue anymore.
I was really struck by some young people who talked about really difficult times when they were 16 and going through school and not feeling like they fitted in at school. And then they transitioned to a new period of their lives. Maybe they were in work, or maybe they were at college. And they would talk about this moment when they finally found their tribe and they finally found people they could connect with. And it was a seismic moment for them. And sometimes you just have to wait to find your tribe, and you may feel like a misfit, but it's not going to necessarily be like that forever. And I think it's really difficult to reassure a 16-year-old that is probably going to happen at some time soon. And until then, in biding their time, it is probably a good thing to enjoy their solitude, because the alternative, which is just continuously being surrounded by people you cannot connect with, is really, really eroding of one's mental health.
I think on that note, that was a great ending, because in my head, we're trying to promote a podcast. So when you're enjoying your solitude, please listen to our podcast. on that,
don't allow your thoughts to be crowded out by ours.
Yeah, okay. But then take a break when the podcast ends and do that self-quiet reflection.
Yeah.
Seriously, Alexandra, that was a delight. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and obviously your own experiences. And have a great day. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.